Again, good evening. John Cassis was the chaplain for the Chicago Bears in the 1980s. And it was during that time that they won their world championship. And he tells them a story in his motivational speeches about a time where Mike Dick, the coach of the Bears at the time, was in the midst of giving one of his famous inspirational speeches at the beginning, before the game had started. And he was going on, and he turned to William, the refrigerator Perry. Probably one of the most famous of the defensive players in the 1980s. I guess we could say offensive too, because he actually scored a touchdown one time. Fridge was a huge, hulking man, and you might guess that just based on his name, the refrigerator. Well, the coach looked over at Fridge and said, "Fridge, after I finish speaking here, I want you to lead us in the Lord's Prayer before we go out onto the field today." And about that moment, he said that, Fridge kind of froze. He nodded, but he froze for just a second. And you could see the look on his face. He was completely panicked. And about that time, Jim McMahon, the outspoken quarterback for the Chicago Bears, was sitting in the back of the room next to Cassis. And Jim turns to Cassis and says, "I bet you he doesn't know the Lord's Prayer. I would bet money he doesn't know the Lord's Prayer." They went on back and forth a little bit, and Jim nudged him one corner. I'm telling you, Fridge does not know the Lord's Prayer. Cassis comes back to him and says, "What are you saying? Everybody knows the Lord's Prayer." Finally, they decided that they were going to make a wager. It was going to be $50 that Jim McMahon was saying to Cassis that the Fridge did not know the Lord's Prayer. So Dick finished his speech that day, and he turned and he said to Fridge, "Okay, go ahead now and lead us in the prayer." Everybody took a knee, and it got extremely quiet in that locker room. And actually, a couple of moments passed before everybody heard the words come out of the Fridge's mouth. "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep." It was about that time that McMahon was disgusted with himself. He took $50 out of his wallet and gave it to Cassis. Sometimes we don't know what we don't know. On that note, we have just a little bit of a trailer for you. The next month, starting in January, in our morning services, we are going to take apart the actual Lord's Prayer. And we're going to look at it for the 4 weeks of January. Join me as we watch this.
Our Father in heaven,
hallowed be your name.
Venga il tuo regno, sia fatta la tua volontà.
Per l'amore che gli sul suo amore.
give us this day our daily bread.
I prostima Bogu naši, kako šalje ložnika naši.
And do not lead us into temptation.
Uvira nam na
For yours is the kingdom, and the power,
i la gloria por siempre. Amen.
Last year, Rick Ashley, the senior preacher at the Hills in Fort Worth, Texas, preached this series. Eric Williamson and I are studying at this time for this lesson series. And I'm going to preach 3 of the 4 weeks here, and 1 of the weeks down at Cape May Courthouse, where Eric is at. And on that Sunday, Eric is going to come here. I believe that's January 20th that Eric will be here. So we encourage you to plan for, to be with us as we take this little crevice search into our series on the Sermon on the Mount, and we dive in deep into the prayer that was offered by the Lord when he asked to teach his disciples. Now, some people are in the dark, and they don't know they're in the dark. But you know, there are other people out there that are in the dark, and they're well aware of the fact that they're in the dark. In just a few moments, we're going to come to what is my favorite time of the year, and that is this candle lighting. But the last thing I want you to do is to be in the dark about what we are saying when we do this. I don't know if you've ever realized this, but God really does some of his very best work in the dark. And if you're in the dark right now in your life, I pray that your heart is open to what I'm about to say tonight. God really does do his best work in the dark. And when you open up the Bible, the very first story that we read in the story is where God is at work in the dark. Has it ever occurred to you that God never used the words, let there be dark? When the Bible opens, it's just darkness. And there it is God at work in the dark. And he opens up his mouth and he says, let there be light. The very earliest stories that we find in the Bible is of a God at work in the dark. And since it's Christmas time, it's fair to remind us that God conceived Jesus in the darkness of Mary's womb. And it's in the darkness that the shepherds get attention from a star, of the glow of the angel that lit the night. And it's in the darkness that the star led the Magi to the place where Jesus was going to be. It's in the darkness as well, though, that Jesus was crucified. And it was in the darkness of the tomb that Jesus was raised from the dead that Sunday morning. If you look at the story of Scripture, from the beginning to the end, from creation to incarnation, from the crucifixion to the resurrection, God does his most significant work in the dark. And that ought to matter to you if you're in the midst of dark right now. Maybe this is why the prophet Isaiah said in chapter 9 and verse 1, nevertheless, there will be no more gloom. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light on those living in the land of a deep darkness. A light has dawned. For to us a child is born. And to us a son is given. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Jesus didn't come to remove the darkness immediately. He came and lit the way for us through the darkness so that we could find him in the light. When you're in the dark, you need a counselor. You need a mighty God. You need an everlasting Father. And you definitely need a Prince of Peace, don't you? And we come to celebrate Christmas. Celebrating Christmas is not a shallow thing of denying the darkness. We're not denying the darkness around us or even the darkness within us. We're just deciding to focus on the light in the midst of the darkness. Because we're recognizing there's far more to the story than the darkness that surrounds you and me. Because God does some of his best work in the dark. No more gloom. Can you say that with me? No more gloom. Let's say it one more time. No more gloom. This feels good, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. So there's a story I want to tell you tonight about a lady by the name of Brenda Schmitz. A couple of years ago, Brenda passed away at the age of 46, suffering from ovarian cancer. While she and her David were still in the process of raising their children, the day that she died, there was a double rainbow over the hospital. And David saw it. And although it was hard to take the moment, he did take it as a cue from God that this was time to release her and to trust in God that he would be there to help him and to help these children. And a couple of years passed by, and David falls in love again. He becomes engaged with the blessing of his children. And on one day, he receives a very strange phone call from the largest radio station in Des Moines, Iowa. It's a famous radio station that for over 20 years has been granting these Christmas wishes for people. They would write down their wish and they would send them in. The radio station would honor these wishes. And so the radio station calls out And he says, I need you to bring your fiancé and your children down to the radio station. Well, first off, he couldn't figure out how he even knew that he engaged because this had just happened. But he gets to the radio station, and they put him on the air, and he truly doesn't know what's coming. And that's when the radio station says that in 20 years that they've done this, they have never once received a letter like this. They opened the letter, and they read on the air. It was from Brenda, his wife, who had now been dead for 2 years. It's a letter that she wrote almost a month before she died. She entrusted the letter to her best friend, with instructions to mail the letter to the radio station only if and when David had become engaged and found his new bride. So David gets engaged. And in the letter, Brenda addresses David and the children and the new fiancé, whoever she may be. She expresses confidence in David that he has chosen the right one. And she blesses the fiancé with her words, and she says, I bless you to be the bride of David. I trust you to be the stepmom of my children. And she then speaks a word to David in the letter, and speaks a word to each one of the 3 children. She closes the letter by asking the radio station to grant 3 wishes. Wish number 1 is that the fiancé would be given a weekend getaway to the spa, so that she would be pampered and prepared for her life with David and their children. The second wish is that the radio station would pay for an all-expense-paid trip to Disney World for David and his wife and all of their children. And the third wish is that the radio station would treat the 8th floor of the Cancer Center there in Des Moines, Iowa, to a special night out of dinner and dancing and drinks for all the doctors and nurses who had cared for all of the people 2 years earlier when she had been there. The radio station agreed, and they granted all 3 wishes. And David and his fiancée and their children were completely undone in the thought. But the thought just captivates me that here is a woman in the darkest days of her life, a month before she dies, and she's thinking about a future for her husband and the children so far beyond her. She wants to make a provision to launch them into the future when the time comes. Even in the midst of profound darkness, light is at work. Last year, it was about this time, right before Christmas Day, that Shannon Wilburn was led to donate a kidney of hers to a man by the name of Walt Irwin. The story is amazing in how this all came about, but the doctors had come to him about a year earlier and told him that his kidney that had been transplanted some 15 years before that was completely worn out, and that he was going to need a new kidney. And the problem with second kidney transplants is that if you have one, your body works up so many antibodies and antigens just receiving the foreign kidney that it makes it unlikely and very difficult that you would ever be able to receive a second kidney. But the prayer request was shared with the church in Tulsa about a year before, that the 62-year-old man was in need of a kidney. And the doctor said that you're going to pass away without a new kidney. And on this day, the prayer request was made. Shannon was in the pews of the congregation that day. She was listening to the words that were being said, but there was a far louder word that was being spoken in her mind, because she could very clearly hear the words, "It's you." Oh, we want God to speak to us, right? Sometimes. sometimes. But every time she went to church for the next month and on after that, she felt like, it's me. And she couldn't do anything about it. She didn't even have the heart to tell her husband, who's the senior preacher at the congregation that they were attending, that she was feeling this and that she felt that she was the one for it. She prayed about it and she fought over it and she finally couldn't hold back anymore. And then she went to her husband and she breaks it to him. And obviously he's understandably pretty reluctant to bless his wife to give away one of her kidneys. And Shannon had some medical issues of her own that she had been going through. But finally, her husband Mitch comes around and decides, well, if that's what you're feeling in your heart, if that's what the Lord is leading you to, we're called sometimes to sacrifice for the sake of others. And she steps forward, and the family is so touched that she was willing to step forward. But the immunologist and the nephrologist that were on the case had their doubts about whether this would even work. Sometimes it's a 1 in a million chance that you find a cross match, the exact cross match required for a second kidney transplant because of the antibodies and antigens that have been built up that are so high in the body. So Shannon went through a series of tests over several months. And wouldn't you know it, she passed every test with flying colors. Shannon was a perfect match. The doctors, they were amazed. And they were absolutely stunned that someone in the same fellow's church who needed this kidney, or he was going to die, came forward and was the match. When most of them have to wait and look all over North America and wait years on dialysis for this to come about. It goes even further because Shannon gave the kidney to a man that she barely even knew, even though they were in the same congregation. But the surgery was a complete and total success. In the midst of this man's darkness, it was overcome that year. When he didn't know if there was going to be a kidney coming his way, there was light at work in the darkness in his very same church. And someone was brave enough to say yes and be part of his miracle. This is the true spirit of Christmas. The kind of Christmas spirit that's able to move beyond yourself and enter into someone else's darkness to give them a brand new kind of future. No more gloom. There's light at work in the midst of darkness. Now, I don't know what kind of darkness that you're feeling or that you sense tonight. But this is what Jesus has done for all of us because of him. There can be so much more to our stories than our darkness. Because he's entered in our darkness. And he's gone to work in our darkness so that we can have a different kind of future. And that's why we're here saying thank you tonight. Because the angel came to Joseph and he says, you are to give him the name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. So tonight, before we light our candles, we are going to open our hearts to his light by taking communion together. Because, as the old hymn says, O holy child of Bethlehem, descend to us, we pray. Cast out our sin and enter in. Be born in us today. Everyone here tonight who honors Jesus as Lord is welcome to partake in this communion. As it passes by, we ask and we pray. Would you pray with me? Lord, I thank you for your presence in this place. Father, we do not deny the darkness in our world. Instead, we focus on the light. And we say to our spirits, no more gloom. We give you thanks that you are a God who is at work in the darkness. From creation to the incarnation, from the crucifixion to the resurrection, from Des Moines, Iowa to Tulsa, Oklahoma, you are a God at work in the darkness. And there's no more darkness because of you. And there's more to our stories than the darkness we've experienced. So as we drink tonight, Father, we can drink to this. We ask, Father, that you would bless this communion, that you would enlighten our hearts before we lighten this room through Christ. It's in his name we pray.